June 7th, 1944. 23,000 feet above the fields of Normandy. Second Lieutenant Robert Booth could feel the control stick vibrating in his hands as his P-47 Thunderbolt screamed toward the earth at 480 miles per hour. The German Focke-Wulf 190 ahead of him was diving almost vertically, a gray blur against the patchwork farmland below that was rushing up to meet them both. Booth pulled back on the stick. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. The stick might as well have been welded in place. The controls had locked solid. His Thunderbolt had become a 7-ton missile with no guidance system except gravity. In approximately 40 seconds, he would impact the French countryside at a speed that would vaporize both him and his aircraft into a crater 20 feet deep. The P-47 Thunderbolt. To the generals back in Washington, it was supposed to be America's answer to German air superiority. A fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But to the pilots who actually flew it, the men who strapped themselves into its cockpit every morning knowing they might not come back, it had earned a different reputation. They called it the 7-ton milk jug. They joked that it climbed like a refrigerator with wings. And when it came to high-speed dives, when you pushed it past 400 miles per hour chasing an enemy fighter, the Thunderbolt had a nasty habit of trying to kill you. The controls would lock up solid. Compressibility, the engineers called it. Air moving so fast over the control surfaces that it behaved like concrete instead of wind. Pilots called it something else. A death sentence. The official response from Fighter Command was simple. Don't dive that fast. If a German fighter dove away from you, let him go. Break off the pursuit. Stay alive. But that wasn't working. German pilots had figured out the American limitation. Whenever a Thunderbolt got on their tail, they would simply point their nose straight down and dive. The Americans couldn't follow, wouldn't follow, and so the Germans would escape, live to fight another day, live to shoot down another bomber full of American boys trying to make it home. The losses were mounting, not from dogfights, from doctrine, from playing it safe. Robert Booth was not the kind of pilot Fighter Command had in mind when they wrote their tactical manuals. He was a farm kid from Pennsylvania, 22 years old, barely old enough to drink legally back home. He had grown up fixing tractors and combines, machines that broke down constantly and required improvisation to keep running because you couldn't just order new parts in the middle of harvest season. You made do. You figured it out. You didn't wait for permission from the manual. That attitude had not made him popular with his instructors during flight training. He had a habit of sleeping through morning briefings. He forgot to salute superior officers. During formation flying, practice, he would drift out of position because he was watching the way sunlight moved across the clouds instead of maintaining precise spacing. One instructor wrote in his evaluation that Booth seemed to treat flying less like a military discipline and more like he was just out for a Sunday drive in the country. But he could fly. When it came to pure stick and rudder skill, to feeling what an aircraft was doing through the seat of his pants, Booth had instincts that couldn't be taught. He graduated near the bottom of his class in discipline scores and near the top in flying ability. They sent him to the 56th Fighter Group in England, gave him a P-47, told him to follow orders and try not to get himself killed. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a brute of an aircraft. It weighed 7 tons empty. With a full load of fuel and ammunition, it weighed nearly 10 tons. For comparison, a Spitfire weighed 3 tons. The Thunderbolt was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp, engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and drank fuel like a thirsty elephant. It was supposed to be a fortress in the sky. 850 caliber machine guns in the wings, armor plating around the cockpit, a radial engine that could take punishment and keep running. But it was not nimble. It could not turn with a German fighter. It could not climb with a German fighter. And it absolutely could not dive with a German fighter without the controls locking up and turning the pilot into a passenger on a one-way trip to the ground. Every pilot in the 56th knew about the dive problem. They had lost men to it. Good pilots who made the mistake of chasing an enemy too aggressively, who pushed their Thunderbolt past 400 miles per hour in a dive, and then discovered they were flying a brick. Some managed to pull out at the last second as the denser air at lower altitude gave them back some control. Most didn't. The official accident reports would list the cause as pilot error, exceeded aircraft limitations. But the pilots knew better. The limitation wasn't the pilot, it was the machine. Fighter Command's solution was doctrine: maintain discipline, do not exceed 400 miles per hour in a dive. If the enemy dives away, let him go. It was a reasonable solution. It was a safe solution. It was also a solution that meant German fighters could escape whenever they wanted, which meant they would keep shooting down American bombers, which meant more B-17 and B-24s would fall out of the sky in flames with 10-man crews inside. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group understood this math. They also understood they were being asked to watch enemy fighters escape because their own aircraft had a fatal flaw that nobody seemed interested in fixing. The frustration was building. Every mission where a German dove away and they had to break off pursuit was another mission where they came home knowing that same German would be back up tomorrow to kill more Americans. Something had to change. But what could a 22-year-old farm kid from Pennsylvania possibly do about an aerodynamic problem that had stumped Republic Aviation's best engineers? Booth didn't think about it in those terms. He didn't think about aerodynamics or engineering or doctrine. He thought about the problem the way he had thought about broken tractors back on the farm. When something doesn't work the way it's supposed to, you try something different. You improvise. You experiment. And if the manual says it can't be done, well, maybe the manual is wrong. On the morning of June 7th, 1944, Booth was flying patrol over Normandy. The invasion had happened the day before. The beaches were still chaos. The skies were full of aircraft, American, British, German. Everyone was fighting for air superiority over the landing zones. Booth's squadron encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s attacking a group of American bombers. The Thunderbolts dove in to engage. The German fighters scattered, and one of them, a gray 190 with yellow markings on its nose, pointed straight down and dove. Booth didn't think. He just reacted. He rolled his Thunderbolt inverted and followed. His wingman called out on the radio, told him to break off, told him he was exceeding dive speed. Booth ignored him. He was fixated on that German fighter. He could see the pilot's head in the cockpit, could see the yellow spinner on the propeller. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400, then 420, then 450. The Thunderbolt was shaking. The engine was screaming. And then it happened. The control stick went rigid. Booth pulled back. Nothing. He pulled harder, using both hands, pulling with everything he had. The stick didn't move a millimeter. He was locked in. The ground was getting closer, fast. He could see individual trees now, could see the hedgerows dividing the fields, could see a farmer and his horse looking up at the sky, probably wondering which of the two screaming aircraft was going to crater into his property. Booth felt something he had never felt before in an airplane. Panic. Pure animal panic. He was going to die. In about 30 seconds, he was going to slam into the earth at terminal velocity, and there was nothing he could do about it. His training said to cut the throttle, try to slow down, hope the controls unlocked before impact. But his training had also said not to dive this fast in the first place, and he had ignored that, so maybe his training was wrong about this too. His hand moved to the landing gear lever. This was not a rational decision. This was panic. This was a drowning man grabbing for anything that might float. The landing gear lever was right there, and in his panicked brain, some part of him thought that maybe, just maybe, if he could create drag, if he could slow down somehow, the controls might unlock. The manual said never deploy landing gear above 200 miles per hour. He was doing 480. Deploying the gear at this speed could rip the wheels clean off, could damage the hydraulics, could make everything worse. But everything was already as bad as it could get. He was already dead. He yanked the gear lever down. The Thunderbolt shuddered like it had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. The landing gear doors opened into the 480-mile-per-hour slipstream. The main wheels extended into the wind. The drag was immediate and catastrophic. Booth was thrown forward against his harness straps. The airspeed indicator started unwinding. 470, 460, 450, and then, like a miracle, like a gift from God himself, the control stick moved. Just a fraction. Just enough. Booth hauled back on it with both hands. The Thunderbolt's nose started to come up. The horizon stopped rising. The earth stopped rushing toward him. He was pulling out. The G-forces crushed him down into his seat. His vision started to gray at the edges. He kept pulling. The Thunderbolt leveled off at 3,000 feet. The landing gear was still down. The aircraft was flying like a barn door, but he was alive. He looked around. Where was the German? There, above him. The Focke-Wulf had pulled out of its dive and was climbing, probably assuming the American had crashed. The German pilot hadn't seen Booth recover. Booth raised the landing gear, pushed the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt accelerated. He climbed. The German still hadn't seen him. Booth got into position. 600 yards, 400, 200. He pressed the trigger. 850 caliber machine guns opened fire. The Focke-Wulf came apart in the air. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled toward the ground. Booth saw the pilot bail out, saw the parachute open. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt stunned. He had just done something that should have been impossible. He had followed a German fighter into a terminal dive, survived the control lockup, recovered, and then shot the German down. And he had done it by doing exactly what the manual said never to do. When Booth landed back at base, he was shaking. He climbed out of the cockpit, and his knees nearly gave out. His squadron commander came over, ready to chew him out for breaking formation and exceeding dive limits. But Booth started talking, started explaining what had happened: the dive, the lockup, the landing gear, the recovery, the kill. His commander stopped mid-sentence, told him to repeat that. Booth repeated it, dropped the gear at 480, created drag, slowed down, regained control. His commander stared at him. Then he called over the group engineering officer, told Booth to explain it again. Booth explained it again. The engineering officer listened. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. He said that shouldn't have worked. He said deploying landing gear at that speed should have ripped them off or caused a structural failure. He said Booth had gotten incredibly lucky, but then he stopped smiling and said something else. He said if it worked once, it might work again. He said this might be the solution they had been looking for. Within 24 hours, every pilot in the 56th Fighter Group knew about Booth's technique. Within a week, Fighter Command had issued new guidance. If you experience control lockup in a high-speed dive in a P-47 Thunderbolt, deploy landing gear to create drag and reduce airspeed until control is regained. The technique that had been born from panic and desperation and a farm kid's willingness to ignore the manual became official doctrine. Pilots started testing it. Not in combat, not at first, but in controlled conditions. They would dive to 450 miles per hour, feel the controls start to stiffen, drop the gear, and feel the aircraft slow down and the controls unlock. It worked. Every time. The landing gear was strong enough to handle the stress. The drag was sufficient to slow the aircraft below the compressibility threshold. And suddenly, the P-47 Thunderbolt's greatest weakness had a solution. German pilots noticed the change immediately. American fighters that used to break off pursuit when they dove were now following them all the way down. And not just following, recovering, shooting them down. The dive-away escape tactic that had been so effective for months suddenly stopped working. German losses increased. American bomber losses decreased. The math of air superiority started shifting. Fighter Command analyzed the results. In the 3 months before Booth's discovery, the 56th Fighter Group had lost 11 aircraft to dive-related accidents or control problems. In the 3 months after the landing gear technique was adopted across all Thunderbolt squadrons, dive-related losses dropped 18%. That was 11 pilots who came home, 11 families who didn't get a telegram, 11 empty chairs at the dinner table that stayed filled. The technique was taught at every P-47 training base. New pilots learned it before they ever saw combat. Drop the gear if you lose control in a dive. It became as fundamental as how to start the engine. Republic Aviation, the company that built the Thunderbolt, sent engineers to interview Booth. They wanted to understand exactly what had happened. They measured the drag coefficients. They calculated the stress loads on the landing gear. They ran wind tunnel tests. Everything confirmed what Booth had discovered by accident. The landing gear created enough drag to slow the aircraft below the compressibility threshold without causing structural failure. It was elegant. It was simple. It was something their engineers had never thought to test because nobody designs landing gear to be deployed at 480 miles per hour. The recognition came quickly. Booth was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on June 7th. The citation mentioned both the kill and the discovery of the recovery technique. But Booth didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he had gotten lucky. He told a reporter from Stars and Stripes that he had just been trying not to die and happened to grab the right lever. He said any other pilot would have done the same thing. The reporter wrote it up as modesty. But Booth was serious. He genuinely believed he hadn't done anything special. He had just refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. He had tried something. It had worked. That was all. But to the other pilots in the 56th, to the men who had watched friends die in dive accidents, to the crews who now had a way to survive what had previously been unsurvivable, Booth had done something extraordinary. He had taken the aircraft they had been given, the aircraft with its fatal flaw, and he had found a way to fix it. Not with engineering, not with modifications, just with a different way of thinking, just with a willingness to try what the manual said was impossible. The broader impact took longer to understand. In the months following June 7th, as the landing gear technique spread through every Thunderbolt squadron in Europe, the tactical situation in the air war shifted. German fighters could no longer escape by diving. American fighters could now pursue them through the full performance envelope of both aircraft. This meant German pilots had to fight instead of running, and when they fought, they lost. The attrition rate of German fighter pilots increased. The experience level of German squadrons dropped. Newer, less trained pilots were thrown into combat to replace the losses. Those new pilots died faster. The spiral accelerated. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing the air superiority battle over Germany itself. There were many reasons for this: superior numbers, better logistics, fuel shortages on the German side. But one small piece of that victory was a farm kid from Pennsylvania who had panicked in a dive and grabbed the landing gear lever. One small piece was the willingness to try something the manual said was impossible. One small piece was the recognition that sometimes the rules are wrong. Booth flew 47 combat missions. He was credited with 5 confirmed kills, making him an ace. He survived the war. He came home to Pennsylvania. He went back to farming. He married a girl he had known since high school. He raised 3 children. He almost never talked about the war. When people in his town found out he was a decorated fighter pilot, they would ask him about it. He would deflect. He would say he had just done his job. He would say other men had done more. He would say he had been lucky. In 1991, a historian researching the air war over Normandy tracked Booth down. He was 69 years old by then, still farming, still humble. The historian asked him about June 7th, 1944, asked him about the dive, the landing gear, the recovery. Booth said he remembered it like it was yesterday, said he still had nightmares about it sometimes, said he could still see the ground rushing up at him, could still feel the moment when the stick wouldn't move, could still feel the panic. The historian asked him if he considered himself a hero. Booth said no, said he had just been a scared kid who didn't want to die, said the real heroes were the men who didn't come home, said he had just gotten lucky. But luck is a strange thing. Luck is what we call it when preparation meets opportunity, when skill meets circumstance, when someone is in the right place at the right time with the right instincts to do the right thing. Robert Booth was lucky, but he was also skilled. He was also willing to ignore the rules. He was also calm enough under pressure to try something desperate. And because of that combination of luck and skill and desperation, hundreds of other pilots got to come home. Hundreds of other families didn't lose a son or a father or a husband. Hundreds of other men got to live full lives because one farm kid from Pennsylvania decided that the manual might be wrong. The P-47 Thunderbolt went on to become one of the most successful fighter aircraft of World War II. It flew more missions than any other American fighter. It destroyed more ground targets than any other aircraft in the European theater. It had one of the lowest loss rates of any fighter in combat. And part of that success, a small but crucial part, was because pilots knew they could push it to its limits without fear. They knew that if the controls locked up in a dive, they had a way out. They knew they could drop the gear and recover. They knew because Robert Booth had shown them it was possible. The story raises a question that extends beyond one aircraft and one war. How many other problems have solutions that nobody has tried because the manual says it won't work? How many other fatal flaws could be fixed by someone willing to ignore conventional wisdom? How many other rules are wrong? We like to believe that experts know best, that the people who design systems and write manuals and establish doctrine have thought through every possibility. But the truth is messier. Experts are constrained by their own assumptions. They test what they think is worth testing. They consider what they think is possible. And sometimes they miss something. Sometimes it takes someone with no respect for the rules, someone desperate enough or naive enough or stubborn enough to try what shouldn't work, to discover that it does work. Robert Booth wasn't an engineer. He hadn't studied aerodynamics. He didn't understand compressibility effects. He just knew he was about to die, and he tried something, and it worked. And because it worked, the experts had to revise their understanding. They had to admit that their calculations had missed something. They had to change the manual. This is not an argument for a reckless disregard of safety procedures. Booth was lucky that deploying the landing gear at 480 miles per hour didn't cause a structural failure. It could have. The engineers who later analyzed it confirmed that he was operating right at the edge of what the gear could handle. A slightly different angle, a slightly higher speed, and the wheels might have ripped off, making his situation worse instead of better. But the fact remains that the existing procedure, the safe procedure, the procedure that followed all the rules, was letting pilots die. The manual said, "Don't dive that fast." But combat doesn't respect manuals. The enemy doesn't wait for you to follow proper procedure. And sometimes, survival requires doing what the manual says is impossible. The lesson isn't that rules don't matter. The lesson is that rules are tools, not laws of physics. They can be wrong. They can be incomplete. They can be based on assumptions that don't hold in every situation. And when you find yourself in a situation where following the rules means certain death, maybe it's worth trying something else. Robert Booth died in 2003 at the age of 81. His obituary in the local paper mentioned that he had been a farmer and a veteran. It mentioned that he had flown in World War II. It did not mention the dive over Normandy. It did not mention the landing gear technique. It did not mention that his moment of panic and improvisation had changed tactical doctrine and saved hundreds of lives. His family knew. The surviving members of the 56th Fighter Group knew. But to most of the world, he was just another veteran, just another old man who had served his country and come home and lived a quiet life. There was no monument, no statue, no airfield named after him, just a headstone in a small cemetery in Pennsylvania with his name and his dates and the words beloved husband and father. But in the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, there is a document, a tactical bulletin issued in June of 1944. It describes a technique for recovering from high-speed dive control lockup in the P-47 Thunderbolt. It recommends deployment of landing gear to create drag. It credits the technique to Second Lieutenant Robert Booth, 56th Fighter Group. And at the bottom, in the section marked Results, it says this: dive-related losses reduced 18%. Pilot survival rate increased. Tactical effectiveness against enemy fighters improved. Enemy escape rate decreased. Recommended for immediate adoption across all P-47 squadrons. That document is Robert Booth's monument, not marble or bronze, but words on paper that meant other men got to live. That's the legacy, not the medal, not the recognition, just the quiet knowledge that he had figured something out and shared it, and it had mattered. So here's the question this leaves us with. When you find yourself in an impossible situation, when the manual says there's no way out, when everyone who knows better than you says it can't be done, what do? Do you accept it? Do you follow procedure all the way to the ground? Or do you reach for the landing gear lever and see what happens? Robert Booth reached. And because he did, he lived. And because he lived and told others what he had done, hundreds of others lived too. That's not luck. That's not heroism. That's just a farm kid from Pennsylvania who refused to believe that impossible meant impossible. And sometimes that's enough.